system for, well, an entire class. I know that because I have taken an entire class on the digestive system. So today we're going to do a real quick run through of the digestive system. And I thought that I would start this one just with a discussion of the anatomy. And when we say anatomy, what do we mean? What's that word mean, the anatomy?
It's like the structural buildup.
Very, yeah, wow, what a perfect answer, yes. Yeah, it is the parts, it's the bits, it's the things that make it up. So the anatomy of your digestive system. So here I have this very accurate and lifelike drawing of a person. And we're just going to make sure we know what each of the structures of your digestive system are. So let's start with the most obvious and go from there. What have we here? We do indeed have the mouth. An important part of your digestive system. Now, excuse me, as we talk here, we're going to kind of quickly talk about direction of movement. There's a very real sense in which your body is just a tube surrounded by some muscle. And food goes in one end of the tube and it goes out the other end when you're done with it. Really, because it spans the length of your body. So it starts at the mouth, and then as we work our way down towards this structure here, we all know, what is that? This little holding center for food there, that is indeed the stomach. What does it travel between the two? From the mouth to the stomach, we go down this tube. By the way, you can see this other tube in front of it. What tube is that? That's the trachea. Where does it lead? To the lungs. Notice it has these cartilaginous rings because your trachea, if it were to become kinked, that'd be a problem because you need to breathe constantly. But we're not talking about that tube here. We're talking about this one that connects mouth to stomach. What do we call that? The esophagus is correct. To do so, it's going to pass through a valve here, but we're going to leave that blank for now. We'll talk about the valves a little later. Hey, what's this muscle here that we're not going to label because it doesn't have anything to do with our digestive system? This muscle right here. That's the diaphragm. And note that the esophagus has to pass through the diaphragm. It's the only thing that does, but they are connected. It's sealed. Just like in these here, you had to use some tape or some hot glue or something to make sure that as the trachea went through here, it was sealed. There's actually another tube, the esophagus, that has to go right through here. But you can imagine if you'd had to have another tube coming down here to go to a stomach, for this to work, you would have to make sure that it was sealed around that. Does that make sense? So the esophagus goes through the word you just said. Diaphragm, thank you. But it is sealed at that location. It is an airtight seal, which this picture almost implies that it's not, but it is. It has to be an airtight seal. Does that make sense? Okay. So we go down the esophagus. I had a professor once who insisted on referring to that as the esophagus. It made me uncomfortable. But if we want to label the diaphragm, we can. It doesn't really relate directly to the digestive tract, but we know what it is, so why not put it in there? Like I said, we will label these valves later, so we'll leave that one blank. Does anyone know next to the stomach what this guy here is? We'll come back to it. We're not worried about that one just yet. First, I want to just travel the journey that food itself takes. So food comes through your mouth, goes down your esophagus, through the diaphragm, into your stomach, and then it's going to go out of the stomach and down into this convoluted path of tubes down here that goes around and around. Does anyone know what these are called? Very good. And specifically, we call these ones the small intestines. And they're so-called small because they are narrower in diameter. And from the small intestines, we actually end up in the the large intestine. Very good. And I shouldn't have made that plural. You have two intestines, the small and the large intestine. Yep.
How does the esophagus attach to the diaphragm? Like, are they connected by muscle?
Yeah, so literally the lining of the esophagus itself is made of muscle, and the diaphragm itself is a muscle, and they just blend right into each other. The last little section of the large intestine is called the rectum. Very good. And the valve through which feces exits is called the anus. Very good. Anus or the anal sphincter. Good. Those are the major paths through which food travels. We're going to come back and add some things to this as we go. In terms of support structures that are also involved. But to start with, we're going to stick with the structures that are actually tubes, that are actually sort of a pathway through which the food follows. Does that make sense? These are all of the structures that food will ever move through in the process of digestion. Okay. So that's good. What's the primary function of the digestive system? What's it do? Process food, very good. It processes food, and for what purpose? Sorry? To get nutrients. What's a nutrient? That's a good answer, by the way. But what's a nutrient? Yeah, good. It's a material that your body needs to function. That can include energy. One of the reasons we eat food is to get energy out of it. That's important. But it's not just energy. We also need building blocks. If you're going to build proteins of your own, you need amino acids. Your body can't make all of them. So to build protein, you need to eat protein. It gives you the parts for it. Does that make sense? So the primary function of the digestive system is to process food and extract nutrients from it. And then we're going to make a quick note and say what nutrients are. Okay, so to process food and extract nutrients from it. How's that happen? What actually happens? What does your digestive system actually do? And we're going to kind of talk about this in terms of stages, which is one helpful way to think about nutrient processing or food processing. So if you are going to eat, what is the first thing you need to do? Yeah, you gotta like put, even before you chew, I mean, this is really elementary, but you gotta like put it in your face, right? Yeah? So the first thing you have to do is you have to put the nutrients into your body, which seems obvious, but every living thing that processes nutrients in one way or another has to put nutrients into their body. Do you know what we call that? Putting nutrients into our body? There's a scientific term for it. Very good. Ingestion. Actually, it would be a better term to say taking nutrients into the body. Taking nutrients into the body. All right. For a human, what does ingestion look like? Yeah, but what part? Literally just putting food into our mouth. The mouth is the entryway for human ingestion. How does, we can contrast that with, say, bacteria, which ingest by a very different process, right? Just by engulfing. or even protozoa or things like that. But most animals have a digestive tract that is similar to ours in that it's basically a tube, and most of them ingest food by having a single entry point, a place where they bring food in. Which, by the way, does it have to be that way? Could you imagine designing an animal that could take food in through its mouth, but also through its hands? Crush it up and take it in there? I mean, you could design that if you wanted to, couldn't you? But the body plan for animals on Earth, for whatever reason, by evolution, has come to be the case that we have one entry point. It tends to be in the head. Does it have to be the case? Is there some ordained reason why the place where we keep our brains that do our thinking have to be the same place we put food in first? Not necessarily. That's just the design. Does that make sense? And what we see in nature is that design is reused and reused and reused. Evolution causes changes, but it doesn't seem to result in whole-scale redesigns, whole-scale differences. So animals basically all have a mouth, and that's how they take nutrients in. Even animals very different from us. You look at a cricket or you look at a snail, they have mouths. You look at a whale and a lamprey and a giraffe. They all have mouths. Interesting. All right. Once you have taken food into your body, and I already, some people have this irresistible urge when you talk about this to start making facial motions. What's the next thing we do with our food? We put it in our mouths and then we chew it. And then we do what with it? We swallow it and we move it down to our stomachs. We'll talk about this more, but what happens in the stomach? Do you know? Yeah. All of this, everything that happens in your mouth and everything that happens in your stomach is about taking food and doing what with it? Breaking it down. All right. And do you know what the scientific word for that is? Ingestion. And then? Very good. Digestion. And this is the breakdown of complex organic molecules into smaller components by physical or chemical means. We have two main ways that we digest food. If you put a cracker in your mouth and you just left it there, I mean, first of all, that'd be gross. But can you picture that? Take like a saltine, like just a classic, like one of those square crackers. No, I said saltine. Pay attention, Preston. So you put a saltine on your mouth and you don't chew on it, you don't do anything with it. What's going to happen to it? It's going to get soggy, and then it's going to eventually just break apart, just disintegrate, right? Because, yeah, you have teeth which physically digest food, right? But you also, your body engages in something called chemical digestion. And believe it or not, your saliva is not just water. In fact, sometimes we do a lab like this, though in COVID I'm disinclined to, where we take a saltine and we take a volume of your saliva, not to get too scientific, but we spit on it. And then we take another saltine and we put an equal volume of just water on it. And what do you think you see? Do the two crackers disintegrate at equal speeds? No, because your saliva actually has very sophisticated chemicals in it. In fact, probably, if you're like me, the fact that we are saying the word saliva and saltine over and over is meaning that you're starting to salivate a bit. Is anybody experiencing that right now? You're getting a little bit of that feeling. If not, maybe I can say this. Salt and vinegar chips. Sour keys. Lemons. Right? You getting that feeling now? A little bit of salivation. That's called a Pavlovian response, by the way. Anyway, your saliva isn't just a liquid secreted by your mouth. It's got chemicals in it called enzymes. And those enzymes break food apart. In fact, do you know what kinds of food the saliva breaks down well? Is grains, starches. Things like bread, crackers, cereal. Your saliva is very effective at breaking that down. On the other hand, you could put a piece of meat in your saliva and it will just stay there. I mean, it will eventually do what meat does and rot, but your saliva will not break it down. You have to go elsewhere for that. That happens in your stomach. But already in your mouth, grains are being digested chemically. But also in your mouth, we are digesting things physically, because what else do you have in your mouth? Teeth. And you have a tongue, and you've got the roof of your mouth. And it's kind of gross to think about, but if you kind of just imagine the act of chewing, there's a lot going on. Yes, your teeth are pulling away at things, but also your tongue is pushing food up against the top of your mouth to break it down. And that all happens subconsciously. But you'll notice sometimes it happens because chew on a piece of pizza when it's too hot and the roof of your mouth burns, because without you realizing it, when you start chewing, your tongue pushes that food up against the roof of your mouth. You've also experienced this if you put a little bit too much peanut butter on a piece of bread, you know? All of a sudden you got all that peanut butter on the roof of your mouth, because subconsciously, as we are chewing food, we're not just using our teeth to break it down, we actually use our whole mouth to break it down. The tongue will force the food against the roof of your mouth, which is curved, but also has these, texture to it, right? Almost like a piece of sandpaper. Why is that? Because it effectively helps tear food apart. The stomach is still involved in digestion. Sometimes we have this mistaken notion that we absorb food in our stomach. Your stomach does no absorbing whatsoever. None. It is just involved in further digesting food. We're going to talk more about that later. It's just breaking food down. But after the stomach, then your food moves into your intestines, right? That's what we showed up here. And that is where the next stage happens. First we ingest the food, then we break it down to make it into as small little pieces as we possibly can. Not just physically small pieces, but molecularly small. If you have big complicated molecules, the enzymes in your stomach break those up into smaller molecules so that they will be easier to absorb. Very good. Which is the third step of food processing. Absorption. Digested molecules are absorbed into the bloodstream to move throughout the body. So if you're in the gym and you are lifting weights and they're very heavy and you're pushing and your muscles are straining and you can feel, the heat and the tension there, all of the energy that those muscles are exerting comes from sugars and other chemicals that were absorbed in your stomach. And how do they get from your stomach to your biceps and triceps and such? They have to be moved there. And how do they get moved there? They get moved there through the blood. To build those muscles in the first place, we needed to build protein, which means we needed amino acids. Those are the building blocks that make up proteins. We'll talk more about that later, especially if you take grade 12 bio. But how do you get those amino acids there so you can build muscle? Through the blood. The blood is your body's transport system. Does that make sense? So that means after we break food down, we have to have a way to get the good stuff from that food, the stuff we want to keep, into our blood. And we don't want to get the stuff we don't want into our blood. So that's a pretty complicated system. We'll learn about it. And then, obviously, after you've taken all the good stuff out, what do you want to do? Sorry? I'm old and I can't hear well. Yeah. We need to get rid of it, right? We need to remove the waste. Once you've taken all the good stuff out of food, and you should hopefully do this very regularly, that's good for your digestive system, we have to engage in Not ingestion, but egestion. The removal of waste from the body. So this is the process that we're going to talk about today, and we're going to relate it back to that anatomy, back to those structural bits. We're going to explain how each of the parts of your digestive system is responsible for this. This will likely span into tomorrow, and that's okay. Maybe not. Maybe I will be uncharacteristically efficient, but let's face it, we've all met me. Okay, what are we looking at here? The mouth. So, you don't need to know all these terms, but we got some teeth here. We have different types. What do we call the teeth at the back of your mouth that are good for grinding food like plant material? These are your molars. What do we call these ones that are kind of in the middle? Well, actually, let's go the other way. Does anyone know what we call the teeth right at the front? Have you heard this word before? Incisors? Yeah. Your incisors are good for cutting. You actually have, beside your primary incisors, you've got two teeth that are, one on each side, that are particularly kind of sharper and pointier than the others. Very good. On humans, they're not much bigger than the other teeth, though on certain animals, they are very pronounced. For example, dogs, which is where this tooth gets its name, we call them the canines. And then these ones are called the premolars. You don't need to have those memorized, but there you go. On each side, you have two incisors, one canine, two premolars, and three molars, and then maybe some wisdom teeth back there if they haven't been taken out. That's the typical human tooth arrangement. And then obviously you have the other side and the top as well. Yeah, if the wisdom teeth come in, they can push the others forward, which can impact them, which is why we often remove them. What do we call these two sections of the roof of your mouth? Obviously, we normally just say the roof of your mouth, but does anyone know the more technical term? The palate and the front of it, if you feel, you can feel this. If you feel the front, it's very rigid and firm. And if you feel further back, it's much softer. And so they are called the hard palate and the soft palate. What's this guy here? The uvula. Very good. And what are these glands right here that sometimes become inflamed and then they need to be removed? The tonsils. Very good. Okay. Okay, what do we do with our mouth? Well, we ingest food in our mouth. But what else do we do in our mouth? We don't just ingest food, we also we taste, that's true, which is good. We digest as well. I know I'm saying we, that's not what I put in my cheat note, I don't like it. How does digestion work in the mouth? Well, we already talked about it a little. Salivary glands secrete saliva, which is a mix of water, mucus, and enzymes. I'm going to mention one enzyme in particular, one called amylase. That's the messiest anyone's ever written that word. Let me try again. Amylase is the one that's responsible for breaking down starches. So I'm just going to mention it particularly, that, you know, the effect of a cracker breaking down in your mouth, that's amylase at work. What do your teeth do? What do we call it when we cut and grind food with our teeth? Well, the most common name is chewing. Does anyone know the scientific term? It is mastication. And the mouth basically shapes food into a ball. Oh, this is all digestion. This is all digestion. So no, I meant to keep it purple. Well, on my screen it looks purple. I don't know what to tell you. I'm sorry. I'm sorry that I don't have my two displays calibrated. Believe it or not, I went down the rabbit hole one day of trying to do that. But the projector, if you want it to be bright so you can have the lights on, it just doesn't have very accurate color rendering. And then you can have it have very accurate color rendering, but then it's quite a bit dimmer. So if you're like, you know, watching a film or something, that's great, but you have to have all the lights off. It's nice to have the lights on because it doesn't feel gloomy. I don't like when the room feels gloomy. Sorry? I know. It's a gloomy day. Okay. So now, if we look on the next page, there's a photo of the hard palate, the soft palate, a uvula, and some teeth. Isn't that charming? And then we have this. This is a real photo from a real cadaver. It has been cut mid-sagittally, which means this was a real person who donated their body to science, and they preserved them, and then they, not to put too fine a point out, ran them through the bandsaw and cut them perfectly in half this way. So that's real. And you can see, first of all, what we talked about earlier, which is, remember we said the nose coming through the nasal cavity and the mouth lead to the same place, right? The throat back here. Can we see that? That this is interconnected space. And you can see we have all the soft tissue of the nasal cavity there, which is full of blood vessels for heating. One thing of note, look how friggin' enormous your tongue is. Yes, and your tongue, you can feel your tongue down here. Try it. Put your finger here. Palpate behind your chin bone, the soft tissue there, and then move your tongue around. And you're going to feel that moving, because that is the bottom of your tongue. Yeah, your tongue is a really big muscle. And it needs to be, because we don't think about it, but your tongue is very much involved in the digestive process. It is pushing food around. And you can see how it's kind of curled underneath here. It can be extended out of the mouth, obviously. You can see there are the teeth, and the top teeth have fallen out in this process, but that's where they would be if they were still in there. Okay. Way ahead of you. By the way, you can see the brain here, the brain stem connected to the spinal cord. You can see this tube in front that has these clear cartilage rings in it. What tube is that? Trachea. Where does it go? If I followed this tube down, where would I go? Lungs. You can see that this tube is always open, right? Whereas, in contrast, this other tube down here is by default closed, where this tube is always open. By the way, what is this structure here? What's that? We come down the mouth, and then if we go through here, we go down to the lungs. What is this? That's the voice box, which is more properly called the larynx. So you can see that for air to come down, it has to make a sharp turn, go through the larynx and enters the trachea. But it's still favorable to do that because by default, your esophagus is closed and the suction comes from here. Now, we said that this structure here was called what? That structure right there on this picture is right there. What do we call that? The uvula. What does it do? Do you know? Yeah, okay, so one thing it does is it stimulates the gag reflex. That's true. In other words, if your uvula is hanging down when food is coming down, its instinct is to make you put it right back out. Does that make sense? If this is in its retracted position or protracted position like this, it doesn't want food going down your throat because it wants to make sure that before food goes down your throat, what has happened? Sure. What else? When you put food down, where do you not want it to go? Here I am a piece of food, and I've been broken down into smaller pieces. Down I go, down I go. Oh! Uh-oh. Where'd I go? Down towards the lungs, and I'm going to get stuck right here. What do we call that process? Choking. Do we want to choke? No. We do not. So before food goes down, before we swallow, or in the act of swallowing, the uvula folds back. And by folding back, what does the uvula block off? Where do we not want our food to go? Into your nasal cavity. Have you ever experienced that? Perhaps you were swallowing a beverage while somebody said something funny, and you spasmed, and your uvula was not closed. And where did that liquid go? Out your nose, because these are connected. So the uvula folds back to prevent food entering the nasal cavity. That's important. We don't want food going into our nasal cavity, but again, what's a much worse place for food to go? Far worse than food entering our nasal cavity would be food entering our lungs or even just the larynx, because they could block it off. So if you look at this structure here, that is called the epiglottis. Yep. And as the uvula is folding back to block off the nasal cavity, the epiglottis squeezes shut to close off the trachea. All right? So this folds down. Oh, the less common spelling of folds with the L before the O. So again, you can see it's this folded structure right here, which articulates right against there. It folds down, and it closes that off, so food will go down past. Yeah. Yes. Is that better? Is that better? Okay. So it's this structure right here. That's bigger than I want it to be, though, now isn't it? Okay. It is this structure right here, which folds down to block off the entrance to the trachea. And again, the entrance to the trachea is the larynx here, is through the voice box. So when the epiglottis folds down to close off the larynx and trachea, that prevents choking. less common spelling of choking, with a C. You can feel it, of course. Palpate your larynx right here. And obviously, men tend to have a more pronounced larynx than women, but even still, if you put your fingers right here, just at the top of your neck, and you swallow, you will feel your epiglottis move your larynx and block off your trachea. Give a swallow. Do you feel it? The whole thing moves up. So basically, this moves up, that folds down, closes the space off. Can you feel that? Very pronounced, right? That is important. So we can say then in swallowing, the bolus of food, and I want to talk about that word in a moment, moves from the mouth into the esophagus. And then moves down the esophagus to the stomach. By peristalsis. Ooh, there's a word. What the hell does that mean? We'll draw a picture. Don't worry. But you understand peristalsis intuitively because you ever try to get that last bit of toothpaste out of the tube? Yeah, what do?
Squeeze it for half an hour.
You squeeze behind it, move it forward a bit, right? And you squeeze behind it again, then squeeze behind it again, squeeze behind it again, squeeze behind it again, squeeze behind it again, squeeze behind it again. Eventually it comes out, right? So if you've got, are you ready for an amazing piece of art? If you've got the esophagus like this, and there's a piece of food here, what we do is we squeeze behind it like that, which forces the food to move forward. And then, again, try not to be intimidated by my amazing art. That just keeps happening. It's the constant squeezing behind of the food that moves it forward through the tube. And that happens because the esophagus is made of muscle. And so there is an instinctive action, a reflexive action, where if there's something inside the esophagus, it is designed to always squeeze behind it, which will move it down. I am nervous to do this. Would anyone here like to do a handstand and eat a granola bar? All right, get on up here.
I don't know how to do a handstand.
I want to demonstrate something, and I want to not kill Preston in the process of doing so. Can I get a couple of people to hold Preston's legs while he attempts to do a handstand? Nathan, come on up here. Kylie, get on. Okay. All right. Why don't we use the section of board here, and we just want to get Preston so he is roughly upside down, and then he's going to eat a granola bar. And what I want to demonstrate is that even if he is upside down, what will he be able to do? Swallow the granola bar and have it move down to his stomach. Now the thing is, if he is upside down, will it be moving down to his stomach?
No.
It will be moving up to his stomach. That's against gravity. Will that work? Here's the deal, it either will or
I'll choke and die.
Preston will choke, which I hope will not happen. It is my strong desire to not have Preston choke and die in this class today. I want you to know that this is my first time doing this activity since several years ago when I did accidentally almost hurt a child. But not as a result of choking, but as a result of somebody just letting go of his legs. So please, don't let go of his legs. All right, can we try this? All right, here we go. Yeah, so hold him out, there you go. That's it. Okay, get support. All right, can I? Just one bite. A little stale. All right, and see if you can swallow that. That's good. You guys have lots of chews in. That's important. That's good. Excellent. Is that? That's good. Thank you. So you can have the rest too. Oh, no, I know. That's so dry. Yeah, I know. I'll dispose it. But there we go. Hey, thank you. You've restored my faith in the ability of high school students to do that without. Have I told you about Garrett Pepper? Who? Garrett Pepper was a student of mine, and we did that, and he successfully ate a cookie, and then he said, "Do you think I could eat 3 at once?" And this is where the teacher and me should have said, "Let's not do this." But instead I said, "Yes." So he did. So he managed to eat 3 at once, and he said, "I bet I could do 5." And then he tried to do 5, and then his girlfriend, who was holding his legs at the time, started laughing, and she just let go. So then he fell, and he was, so you're wise, and you just kind of kept your head along the ground, so if they did let go, you wouldn't just, but he was doing the straight up handstand. And when they let go and she was laughing, he started laughing, then he fell, then he hit his head, then he was like kind of like just laying there going like, "Argh!" And I was, yeah, it was nerve-wracking. My career flashed before my eyes, but it was good. We all made it. But the point being, Preston, and thank you very much, Preston, you're a very good sport. Preston just defied gravity, right? He moved food up into his stomach. And the reason he was able to move food up to his stomach is because gravity does not pull your food down, which you know, right? If you instinctively think about it, imagine trying to put imagine, I mean, this is gross, but take a hamburger, put it in a blender, right? Can you picture that? And then just put it in this tube. Is it going to make its way down? I threw it out. You said you didn't want it. You can go get another one if you want. There's lots of stuff in my office. If I just put it in this tube, it's just going to kind of sit there, right? And glop and be gross, right? It has to actively be moved down. And the process by which it's actively moved down is called peristalsis.
I read peristalsis. I see the extra. I read it super slow.
Do you guys want me to write a paragraph explaining how that works, or does the picture, and then if I said think tube of toothpaste, kind of get the job done for you? Because I feel like that's the kind of thing you could write 2 paragraphs trying to describe, but I think we instinctively get it. Yeah? And we'll say that the muscle wall of the esophagus. The primary cell type in the esophagus is muscle tissue. In fact, we call it smooth muscle tissue. It's designed to squeeze. Of course, what other cell type must be on the esophagus? It's made of smooth muscle primarily, but it's exposed to outside materials like food. What must be lining it? What type of cell? Anybody? Cell type that protects things from the outside world? Epithelial tissue. Good. And of course, what type of tissue must hold the epithelial tissue to the muscle tissue? Connective tissue. And how do those muscles get told when to squeeze? Nerve tissue. There are 2 types of nerve tissues. There are what are called stretch sensors, and they're exactly what they sound like. Their job is to notice when a stretch happens. So they notice when food moves in and the esophagus has to stretch out, and then they send, it's very clever design, they are all designed to send messages backwards. So if they stretch out, they send a message to the cells up above them in the esophagus and say, hey, squeeze. So wherever there's a stretch, the esophagus is designed to squeeze behind it. And that will always move the food forward towards the stomach. Pretty clever, don't you think? I think. All right, when we get into the stomach, here's where we go. Sorry? Yeah, we're gonna label it. Sorry, yeah. Just there we go. Goodbye. You know, the white pencil used to be pure white, and I think people complained that it like wasn't visible. But to me, why would you want a white pencil except to make things invisible? And so they changed it, so now it's just ever so slightly gray, and it makes me furious.
Well, drop. Good.
I am. Like, I don't know if you can see it, but I can see that.
Oh,
And it makes me angry. There's no pure white. Isn't that ridiculous? Like, that's as white as it will let you get now. So I put in a suggestion in the Microsoft suggestion box and said, give me back my white pencil, please, and thank you. Yeah. Sharply worded. Sharply worded. Right? Okay. When the bolus of food, and by the way, bolus is a word I'm going to keep using. It just literally means like big ball of food. It's Latin. Latin literally means ball. When the bolus of food enters the stomach, it passes through a valve. This is called, depending on which textbook you read, either the esophageal sphincter, esophageal sphincter. Esophageal because it closes off the passage between the esophagus and the stomach. Sphincter is a type of valve. It's made of smooth muscle, and it is designed to squeeze tight. Anytime you want to close a tube off in the human body, we use a sphincter valve. A sphincter valve is different than the valves of the heart. The valves of the heart have flaps that close, but sphincter valves just squeeze. It's basically just take a hose and squeeze it till it's shut. And then when you let go, it opens. Does that make sense? So a sphincter valve is just some smooth muscle around the tube that can squeeze so it's shut. Sometimes this is called the cardiac sphincter. Why would it be called that? I mean, it has nothing to do with the heart, but it is really close to the heart. In fact, it's just behind the heart. In fact, you have probably experienced at some time in your life when your esophageal sphincter didn't close properly and a little bit of your stomach acid made its way into this part of your esophagus. What do we call that? Heartburn. We call it heartburn because it feels like it's happening in your heart. It can be a little scary. But in fact, it has nothing to do with your heart. What you are feeling is stomach acid, which is normally protected from damaging your stomach by the epithelial tissues of your stomach, attacking the epithelial lining of your esophagus, which does not have anti-acidic properties. So heartburn has nothing to do with your heart at all. It's stomach acid burning away at your esophagus. And prolonged heartburn can be dangerous. It's bad for you. Small little acute heartburn can just be an inconvenience, annoying. But so for that reason, they sometimes call this the cardiac sphincter. Cardiac, of course, means heart, because the cardiac sphincter is basically right behind the heart. But a better name for it is the esophageal sphincter, because what it actually does is it blocks off the esophagus. We have a second sphincter valve here, this one down here, which is called the pyloric sphincter. The pylorus is the bottom half of the stomach, so the pyloric sphincter is just the sphincter at the bottom of the stomach. When your stomach gets going, it's important that these two valves be closed, because your stomach is going to churn, push, press, break down food. And if those valves were open, as it is squeezing, what would the food just do? Imagine you put a bunch of food in a balloon and you start squeezing it. What's it going to do? It's going to squirt out, right? So if you want it to stay in there, you'd have to tie the balloon shut, right? So when your stomach is working, it's extremely important that these two valves be closed, right? Think about your blender. Have you ever accidentally turned the blender on without putting the top on the blender? Lord knows I have. What happens? Goes everywhere, right? Have you done that?
Almost, but my brother has.
Yeah, I definitely have. Including one unfortunate incident where I did so during a science lab. And let me tell you, that made a mess. So you learn your lesson. So there's also a valve at the bottom of the stomach. These are both closed, except when food must pass through them. So the esophageal sphincter and the pyloric sphincter need to be closed when the stomach is in action to make sure that the stomach is able to digest the food without just sending it back up into the esophagus or down into the small intestine before it's really ready to go into the small intestine. So what does your stomach actually do? Well, it does two things. Yes. Yeah, so in the case of the esophageal sphincter, it has to do just like the stretch sensors all through the esophagus. When the stretch sensors here that push the food down activate, they also open the esophageal sphincter so at that last step food can go down. The pyloric sphincter is controlled by a different mechanism, which basically is designed to open up after a certain amount of digestion has happened. So they're different control systems because they do different tasks. That's a great question, by the way. And I don't know any more than that, though I'm sure there's a more sophisticated answer out there. I don't know it. Now, the primary function of the stomach is not to absorb nutrients. Let's just put that down here. Nutrients are not absorbed in the stomach. You don't have to put that if you'll remember that. But I think we're taught from the time we're a little kid that like food goes into your belly and then you get the energy out of it. You know, oh, you got lots of sugar in your belly. But nutrients are not absorbed in the stomach. The stomach is a digestive organ. And the stomach digests food in two ways. Mechanical digestion and chemical digestion. How does the stomach mechanically digest? Well, the stomach is made up of 3 layers of muscle. So if this is your stomach, there's one layer of muscle that runs like this. There's another layer of muscle that runs like that. And there is yet a third layer of muscle that runs kind of at an oblique angle like this. And these squeeze kind of one at a time. So if you can imagine, the ones that run this way squeeze, they squeeze the food one way. Then the ones that go this way squeeze it another, and then that way. And these just alternate between them. They rhythmically squeeze, rhythmically contract. Goodbye. To churn the partially digested food. And if you've ever made dough or batter or anything like that, you know that as you work something like that, it becomes more homogeneous and more broken down and more kind of regular. So the stomach mechanically digests your food. This is also, by the way, sometimes when your stomach is empty, you can hear it kind of quote unquote rumbling. That's because it is kind of working like this when it shouldn't be, and you're feeling your stomach muscles churn away. At the same time, the cells of the stomach lining produce gastric juice. Yeah. Correct. And enzymes. Now, if I could make a request to the world, it would be that they stop using juice to describe anything other than things that we drink on purpose. But here we are. The cells of the stomach lining produce gastric juice. And gastric juice is a mix of hydrochloric acid, and various enzymes. And remind me, what do enzymes do? Enzymes aid chemicals in breaking up into smaller pieces. So mechanical digestion breaks the pieces of food down into smaller pieces, but enzymes actually take the big molecules that are in the food and help chop them into smaller molecules. So both of these things are happening at the same time. Pepsin in particular is responsible for breaking protein down. So pepsin will take pieces of protein like meat and things like that and break them down into individual amino acids, which is important because we need to be able to break down amino acids. I'm not going to write this here, but your stomach is so acidic that the stomach lining also has to produce a layer of mucus that protects it. Does anyone know what we call it if a section of your stomach stops producing that mucus and the stomach begins being damaged by its own acid? There's a name for that, a stomach ulcer. You ever heard of an ulcer before? You get an ulcer when a section of your stomach lining, and this can happen as a result of bacterial or viral infection or for other reasons, but if a section of your stomach lining stops producing the mucus that it needs to prevent damage via hydrochloric acid, then the acid in your stomach can actually begin digesting your stomach, which, if you're wondering, is bad. We don't want that. So there's this mucosal layer that is produced by the epithelial cells of the stomach that is extremely important to prevent damage. And people who have ulcers experience a lot of pain and discomfort, and they have to be very careful about what they eat. Questions about that? All right. Hey, what's the valve that food has to pass through, the bolus has to pass through as it enters the stomach? Yeah, what's it called? The esophageal sphincter. Good. What a weird word that is. Think sphinx, but sphincter. So the esophageal sphincter, we enter the stomach. There, mechanical digestion happens because there's 3 layers of muscle that churn the food. Chemical digestion happens because there's hydrochloric acid and gastric juices and pepsin and other enzymes that break all those molecules apart. Eventually, we get this kind of gloopy paste of food called chyme. Chyme, C-H-Y-M-E. Isn't that a gross word for a gross thing? And it is ready to move on to the next location in our digestive tract, which is after the stomach, we go to the small intestine. To move from the stomach to the small intestine, we have to pass through another valve. What valve do we pass through? Yeah, and that's because this region of the stomach is called the pylorus. Makes sense. So the bottom half of the stomach is called the pylorus. That is the pyloric sphincter. From the pyloric sphincter, here, we leave the stomach and enter the small intestine. Now, I want to note something. You'll really see if you look at this, and when we do our animal dissection, you're really going to see this. The stomach is really just a part of the tube. The esophagus is a tube. The stomach is part of the tube. It's just bigger, and it's got more muscle around it. And then it gets narrow again as it goes into the small intestine. It's one continuous tube. The small intestine, we divide into 3 sections. And we'll give... Does anyone know the names of the sections of the small intestine? Anyone? No? Fine. The first section is called the duodenum or the duodenum. Oh, now I'm curious. How will Google say we pronounce this one? Not going to put your report cards up on screen. No. 4.
Duodenum.
Duodenum? Not a chance. Duodenum?
Duodenum. Duodenum. Duodenum.
I've literally never heard that. Jejunum, yeah. Yeah, well,
It makes sense that it's duodenum.
I guess.
Jejunum.
Okay, that's how I've always said that.
Ileum.
Ooh, 1L. Whoops. Yeah. I have also always spelled it with 2 L's. That's interesting. What do I know? In any case, duodenum? All right, well, I guess I got to do what Google tells me. So we have the duodenum. I will say it that way exactly twice and then forget. I always learn duodenum, but whatever. Okay. And then the next is called the jejunum, because these words are committed to being as challenging for Joe to say as humanly possible. Jejunum. And then finally, the ileum, which I had always spelt with 2 L's. And even if I show you like the filled in version of this diagram, there's 2 L's there. So I don't know, that's strange. But again, I'm going to trust Google. What do I know? And I want you to note, if you were to take your small intestine and unwrap it, just your small intestine, it would be approximately 4 to 5 times your height. The big long tube. Yes. Your small intestine is 4 to 5 times longer than you are tall.
Imagine being the first person to figure that out. Like you are dissecting someone. It goes forever.
And this is necessary because we need to give food time to have its nutrients absorbed. And we have a diet that is a mixture of plant and animal. Animal digestion happens fairly easily. It is pretty easy to to absorb the digestive remains of fats and protein, but carbohydrates and plant-based stuff takes a bit more work. So we have a relatively long digestive system, but you will see that if you look at the digestive systems of vegetarian animals, they tend to have very, very long, complex small intestines. And if there are animals that eat only meat, they tend to have very simple and very relatively short small intestines, which is interesting. Okay, so food, now a paste called chyme. leaves the stomach and enters the duodenum. Duodenum? Forget it. I wish I hadn't made that the same blue as the titles. So we'll do that. Okay. The small intestine is responsible for a tiny bit of digestion, but mostly it is involved in absorption. We might want to mention it's about 6 meters long. And it's about 2.5 to 4 centimeters in diameter. Okay, the first 25 centimeters or so of the small intestine is called the duodenum. What is the first thing you would want to do with chyme coming out of the stomach? What did we just say about the stomach? That it released all these gastric juices, and what's the main gastric juice it releases? Stomach acid, which is just hydrochloric acid, which is extremely acidic. What is the first thing you want to do with the chyme coming out of the stomach? Chemists?
What?
Chemistry students, what's the first thing you want to do with that extremely acidic chyme that has just come out of the stomach?
Face on.
I don't know what that means.
Face on.
Oh, I heard put a face on. I'm like, as a drawing? Yes, we want to, very good, we want to neutralize it with a base. Now the thing is, we don't want to have a strong base lying around. That's as dangerous as that. So we use a weak base. We use something called a buffering system. So we use, actually, and this is really interesting, do you know what your duodenum, if you Google, secretes? Baking soda. Sodium bicarbonate. A baking soda solution. So your stomach releases hydrochloric acid, which acidifies the chyme. The first thing that happens is that the pancreas secretes sodium bicarbonate to neutralize the chyme. This reduces the pH, it neutralizes it. You don't really need to write it neutralizes the pH. This isn't a chemistry class. But it prevents damage to the small intestine. See, the thing is, we are now going to try to absorb the nutrients from this. To do that, we need to have very thin cells, and we need to put blood vessels right close to it, right? Do we want to fill our blood with hydrochloric acid? No, we do not. That would be bad. Do we want to put very thin, unprotected cells in a solution of hydrochloric acid? No, that would be very bad. So, the pancreas secretes sodium bicarbonate, which neutralizes the chyme. All right, we're going to pick up there tomorrow. Sorry, I know it's a long one. I hope you're finding this reasonably interesting. I find this interesting. and we will carry on tomorrow. You guys have been wonderful.
I thought Heartburn